Welcome to another episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. And it's not always that I want to start a conversation with a quote, but preparing for this conversation today, there came a quote to mind from Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game. And it says, "No permanence is ours. We are a wave that flows to fit whatever form it finds." So it's my great pleasure to be in this virtual room connected from Berlin to Costa Rica with Stephan Rechtschaffen. When I did a little bit of background research about you, Stephan, I know that I myself spent many years in workshops, monasteries, retreats with spiritual teachers, and now I'm in a conversation with a guy who co-founded Omega Institute, a big retreat center in New York, and is now at Blue Spirit Costa Rica. So before we dive into all the weeds of the bullet points, my first question, because I always want to bring the human aspect, that's so often left out in conversations, especially in podcasts. I don't want to leave that out. So my first question is, if you were to distill the turning points and lessons of your life phases into pearls of wisdom, what would they be from your childhood? If there comes something up where you say, oh, wow, that's really something rich and beautiful that I want to share, or your adolescence. And since you're also 2.5 years older than me, like what pearls of wisdom do you feel like sharing from your adult life? Stephan, the floor is yours.
Alistair, so wonderful to be with you. And just to start, in the fact that you chose to read from the Glass Bead Game and Hermann Hesse, I found moving, because Hermann Hesse, earlier in my life, the two books that most struck me were The Glass Bead Game and Journey to the East. And just recently I was rereading Journey to the East because he was one of the great visionary storytellers that really talked about the inner life, the spiritual world, and the significance of that, which I think is important for us to look at, because early in our lives is when we have the opportunity of the seeds that give us later on this kind of inner deep connection. And my concern in the world right now is that in our rush for the digital world, for the speedier world, we're not having enough time to spend time in the inner, deeper world. So my introduction, I just would say I was born in actually Brooklyn, New York. My grandparents came over from Europe, having escaped the pogroms, the Holocaust, and as I watch what's happening in Ukraine now and in Eastern Europe, that was from Western Ukraine and Poland. That's where my relatives came from to, in those days, escape to the United States. So though I grew up in the United States, I could see the imprint on my parents, who were just so bought into the US and the safety there. And yet, quite honestly, I never really saw that. Although I grew up born in the late 40s, grew up in the 50s there, where we were at the peak of having gone past World War II, and there was a refrigerator in every house and a washing machine, and life was only going to get better. I became part of that era of discontent in the 60s, and that to me was a revolutionary call to waking up of society from the Vietnam War and the psychedelic movement, which I jumped into, and then beyond that into the whole spiritual world. I remember that as a child, there was always this feeling that that there was something more that we could be doing, and looking out into what the future was. And my father had become sort of the first in his family. He became a doctor, and I really so valued what he had gone through in his life that myself and the other siblings, I was the oldest, became doctors. Yet once I started to move into the medical world, I began to see very, very quickly that medicine was based on the pharmaceutical industry, it was based on money again. And so I very quickly became one of the alternative doctors. It became holistic doctors. It became all of the various names that we now have, these new doctors that do different types of things. When I started in my medical practice, I actually was a hippie who was doing home births for people back in those days. But what was most, at that moment, transformative for me was that while in medical school, and I had stepped into medical school as a hippie, I looked around the room and everybody was in their jackets and ties, and I clearly stood out. I'm a relatively shy person, so when I looked around and saw I was the only one who was looking like that, I thought, well, I'll sneak into the back room and in the back of the room, and no one will sort of notice that I'm sticking out. And within a week, they decided to have a vote for the president. And I hadn't really known anybody, but I was immediately voted president of the class. And I realized it was because I was the only one who had kept my values and wasn't going to sell out when I got there. I wasn't a very good president for the class, but nonetheless, I went through medical school. And at the end of medical school, a professor came up to me and said, you know, I've been watching you. I hadn't known her. She was a professor of parasitology. And she said, I noticed you, and I think that I could get you a scholarship to work in anywhere you'd like in the world, if you'd like to go do that for a while. She said, where would you like to go? And my immediate response was India. And so I found myself up in the Himalayas, 8,000 feet up where, so this was now the early 70s, where Tibetans were coming across the mountains. And it was, for me, a life-changing event. In addition, I met, through someone else, I met a being who lived on the floor of a temple. He was a man in his 80s. He had been a professor, and he had joined the Satyagraha movement and become very close with Mahatma Gandhi and gone to prison with Gandhi. And at that time, he gave up everything to simply become a Bhagwan. This is not the Bhagwan Rajneesh. A Bhagwan means God, just somebody who's living in the God realm. And he just sat silently in the back of the temple on the floor, and I would go to the hospital in the morning and then spend the rest of the day with him. And Bhagwan really changed my life. And in that way, his English was perfect. He was a scholar from having been a professor, but his devotion to there's something else. And that for me was a profound change, and had me, you know, he said, man can rise above death, disease, and decay. And he said, the problem is the doctors cause the illness and the lawyers cause the fighting. So we have to change our ways. And so I came back to the United States committed to really creating change. I was involved with another Piralite, another spiritual teacher, who I then took on running a community. We bought an old Shaker village. We moved 100 people there. Somehow I was in charge. I've been picked to sort of sort it all out. And it was a great experience to learn when you take 100 people together, which is the issue that you and I just saw in emerge. When you bring all these people together, how do you create something with, it seems that in the world now, you know, if you're militaristic, you just do that. You follow what they say. When you're a group where you're trying to, everybody have a voice, it gets very quickly chaotic, and it very quickly gets ingrown. So we set up all these different businesses. It was hand to mouth, but it was a great experience. But from there, I moved on and I started, by that point, I started Omega and reached out to people like Ram Dass, who became a very dear friend throughout his life. And I spent a lot of time with him. And I created a board that included Pir Vilayat Khan, the Sufi teacher, Ram Dass, Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. So what we were looking for is not, it was a nonprofit, but I wasn't looking for money. I was looking for who are the luminaries. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross would come back in those days. I had people who, Linus Pauling, we had Nobel laureates coming. At any given time, we had people coming with the best-selling books of the time, probably more than Harvard or UCLA or Princeton had at that time. We were looking for who were the outliers, who could really start to help us navigate the path ahead. So that was its purpose. There was Esalen out on the West Coast and there was Omega out on the East Coast. We were quite large at the time. Thich Nhat Hanh of the, you mentioned we started with a meditation in a little bowl, and Thich Nhat Hanh would come and he'd have thousands of people. My dearest friends now who I'm about to go see, Joan Halifax was on board. She spent close time with Thich Nhat Hanh, and Christiana Figueres, who I'll talk about in a while, who was a treasure of Costa Rica. She's really been one of the leaders of the green movement of the world right now. So these were people that I sought to bring to not only at Omega, but now in Costa Rica here, to have places where there are wisdom holders who come and gather. And that to me has really been what's mostly sort of helped me follow whatever that path is, because the path can be following money, the path can be following fame, or the path can be following the unexplored path. And so I've chosen that the unexplored path is really where I believe we need to go if we're going to really make the necessary changes in our world. And it's one of the reasons I came down here to Costa Rica. And I can tell you much more.
So besides most likely both of us agreeing to walk the path of love and spread the love, I want to bring in the word discernment. So I'm much younger than you, obviously, but when I started my own soul search, which by the way was also sparked by reading Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha when I was 15 or so, and then my father was wise or wicked enough to put me in front of a fully realized, whatever that means, but very powerful master who was a Benedictine monk and a Zen Buddhist, both in the Rinzai and the Soto tradition. So the mala I'm still wearing from him, his name was Williges Jäger. And like Benediktushof near Würzburg, where my parents still live, is like the biggest retreat center in the whole of Europe. Mm-hmm. So I'm just mentioning this because I want the two of us to engage in a dialogue of what I think has mainly happened, certainly in Europe over the course of, I would say, the last 20 years. So capitalism is very smart and clever at usurping everything and turning it into a commodity. So not everything is bad of that in terms of like access and spreading the word. And we're now having, at the tip of one click on YouTube, the biggest masters of all lifetimes, but also hence, us dialoguing and taking discernment into the middle of the room is, I also see a lot of phony gurus. And with the third wave of psychedelics, also a lot of very young people that for sure had a Godhead, oneness, emptiness, whatever experience. And then they already show up as masters or teachers. And this even gets worse because the whole mechanism of social media rewards those who are selling themselves better. So what I mean was that the spiritual market out there now, we're recording this in July 2022, is like vastly different than, let's say, 45 years back when you founded Omega. So I want to less focus on the problems and more on the solutions. How do you make sure that when you invite the people or you get a recommendation from somebody to discover a new teacher, what are like your vetting criteria? Because I certainly internally have this gurus list, you know, the famous gurus list from the guy who wrote like the only biography about Bhagwan, like Sri Rajneesh Osho, you know, who has a guru list, you know, so which is very interesting when you go into these thousands of names. So I know you have been working with some of the biggest names of the last century, right? Which, I mean, what an incredible gift that is to your soul and to providing that wisdom. But where is your own discernment clicking in?
Well, I don't know where it came from, but I believe discernment is something that I've really developed, perhaps from all the varying experiences I had of doing this, because I was basically the back of the house. And it was always interesting to see the difference, or not the difference, when the speaker was in front of the curtain and then dealing with me behind the curtain. And so the question becomes, when is the person true? It doesn't matter who they're talking with. So I remember when we had our community in Pirvalai Khan, a Sufi teacher, just an incredibly sweet, deep being. He wanted to raise some money, but I remember we would go somewhere, he was trying to raise money, but he would talk to the person who was most interesting, not necessarily the person who had the most money. And money has changed things, marketing has changed things, and I would often find that some of the best teachers we would have at Omega were ones who drew far smaller crowds and the ones who got the big crowds and became very well known. Now there are some very, I don't want to say it wrongly, because there are some very well-known teachers that I have the highest respect for. So you find that somebody who really, when you meet them, who they are is not different than when they're on the stage. And that to me becomes really important. It's when is somebody in their being in such a way that the circumstances don't change who they are. And so too many are trying to be this there, but the minute they're with their kids, the minute they're, they don't get paid enough, or there's something. So it's, how do we be really in the same attitude with whoever we're talking about? Not when you're talking with somebody who's famous and then you turn around to somebody who's working for you and you go like that. And I've seen too much of that. And to me, this is the problem at the time right now between the introverts and the extroverts of the world. Everybody who's just trying to push ahead, and it's a very difficult one to deal with, especially as media and marketing rewards in the terms of money, not in terms of happiness, not in terms of contentment, but as we know, one of the problems, and you raise the area of the psychedelics, and we do see this regaining, which I think is extremely positive, of the world of psychedelics. I was involved in it back in the 60s, but even then, as all of these medicines came around, I spent time in the jungles in South America, and actually I have 3 wonderful sons and brought them each sort of as rite of passage to spend time in the jungle to explore with ayahuasca and the medicines. And one of them still leads retreats here, and this is his path. So I have great respect for that, because we need to be, in a way, we humans get so individualistic. When we look at the plant world, our nature world, the nature world is we. It's not so focused on I. We've gone to the point where this I nature is what's, as opposed to it's we, it's us. It's why I love Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, there is this feeling of the we. When I look out at the nature world around me, there's this feeling of the we. And somehow we have to find our way back to that. And that to me is where we have a conundrum now, because it takes a lot of work to do that. But that's where, you know, I remember, and that's why one of the profound things, even in doing some of this medicine work, I think many people need the psychedelics to be cracked open, to realize that the I that they're focused on isn't really the game. It's really something beyond the I. And this to me is why we need that. I'm not saying everybody should be on psychedelic. It's just a doorway. Once you got to go through the doorway, you have work to do. You have to walk down the hall. You have to see what else is there in the house, and so on. And this is where meditation practice. This is where spending more time caring for those around us than just ourselves is where we start to feel contentment. I'll just say one more thing with that, is that we have in our body, one of the things that the medicines click on is it affects our serotonin in the brain. And so much of what our world is about, all the addictions, is dopamine. Dopamine gives you a, I feel good, but then it goes away. I feel good, then it goes away. And so whether we're talking about heroin, crack, sugar, buying, all of these dopamine things makes the I feel better, and then it crashes, and we keep looking for the I, instead of realizing that instead of always trying to get high all the time with something else, like making more money. And I've been in the nonprofit world forever, and now I run this retreat center here, and I was originally going to do it as a nonprofit, but I couldn't do it as a nonprofit in Costa Rica, so I had to borrow money and stuff like that. And now all of a sudden it's made money, and people start coming to me. Do you want to do more? Should we set up a few more retreat centers? I go, no, I'm really content. I'm really, enough is enough. If I can do something to help people, fine. But and I'm happy to help people set up retreat centers. I just don't want to do it again. I'm happy.
But you also did it. You also did it for quite a while. So I mean, I could not agree more. And I wonder, because before I dive deeper into a critical appraisal of the third wave of psychedelics and how I really think this also needs, again, some discernment, so that people complement their peak experiences with state training. And curious to riff off that with you. But before we do that, I have a very undiplomatic ask. Let's stay with the gurus list. And instead of bashing, unless you want to bash one or two people back in the 70s, you don't have to, is like, what are the couple of absolutely outstanding teachers, or maybe also personal experiences, that you had over the last decades? I'm really just curious, because some of the people I never met, some of the people I only read the transmission or heard the transmission, it was already powerful. Yeah, so curious, like, what are your superstars?
Well, I already mentioned Ram Dass and Joan Halifax. And I really consider these two utterly, their quest is for deeper realization, and their quest is for helping others. As Ram Dass wrote books, How Can I Help? As the work of Joan Halifax now at her Upaya Center, where I'm going next week, she is become world renowned, and it's really about how can she give out into the world. my dear friend John Kabat-Zinn, who really put so much work into the whole realm of mindfulness, Hema Chodron and her teaching. And then I'm very profoundly affected by the teachings of many of the great Tibetan teachers. And I would say, though I did long practice with Zen meditation, I got very involved with Sufi practice. The reason I feel so drawn these days, and that it is the path that I follow, which is Tibetan practice, is that I have a book I read quite frequently and just read it over and over. And these are passages from some of the Tibetan teachers from the year 900, from the year 1000, from the year 1100. And I read it, and it speaks to me as coherently and clear as if someone was writing it today. So one gets a sense that the recognition, the inner recognition that they had then is as relevant as what we can have right now. So the issue with the varying teachers is whether or not they're telling people what to do, or they're actually listening with the people as to what's coming up. And they're not making themselves as, I know, you don't know. And I've seen too many teachers who know, and then someone else feels that they don't know, so they better listen to the teacher and give teacher money and then bow down to. Too many teachers who would never let somebody bow down to them because we're on the path together. And maybe one person is a little bit ahead, and then you're saying, come on. And then you find somebody, we're all in this together. And that together is where it's most important, because too many of the teachers that lead people astray are really focused on the I. And I've seen so many scandals over the years about that. And the scandals come for a reason, because someone has held themselves up to be, and then all of a sudden it realizes, hey, there was a false bottom to the whole thing. And that I've met many teachers who are really profound, but they're also willing to say where they're working on it. I would find that with Ram Dass all the time. He would be like, he would say, oh yeah, but I'm still messed up in a certain way. And I appreciated that. It was still the humanity. So to me, one of the ways of evaluating a teacher is not someone who knows. It's just somebody who's on the path, perhaps a little bit ahead of us. So when Thich Nhat Hanh would come to Omega, and I remember the first time he was at Omega, I'm sitting in my office talking to two people. And this was in the early days, so he didn't have a large group with him. And we had a garden, and he was walking through the garden. And it was just a very slow way he would walk, just step by step. And everybody following with very deep meditation. I remember looking out, and I became completely transfixed by watching him walk. I forget who I was in a meeting with or what we were talking about, but I could feel dropping into that presence that he was holding. And he wasn't holding it just for himself. He was holding that for everybody who was there, to help bring them into that field that right now in our world, we need people who help us step into that field and recognize that we're all here together and we're just doing our life, and how can we help each other?
Just a couple of weeks back, I've been recording actually a very long podcast with Diane Musher Hamilton. And I wonder, I don't have the feeling we need to again like unpack the whole integral framework. I stumbled over the oeuvre from Ken Wilber when I was 24 and was 7 years into deep contemplative and spiritual practice, but still pretty much did not have my shit at all together. And I really think there are a couple of components in the integral framework. Whether we totally agree or not, for me, is not really important, is complementing the way into unity, God consciousness, whatever you want to call it. So the ascension, for the lack of a better word, with the shadow work piece. So certainly when I, as Alistair, look back into the 70s as proponents such as, for example, Bhagwan Sri Ramesh or Chogyam Trungpa, it becomes pretty obvious that the typology of these masters nowadays would not be possible at all, right? So there was a unique positioning in space-time where they left their transmission and also made a ton of mistakes. But I really think there's the timeless piece. Obviously, when you want to wake up to that which is timeless, right? Then you can read the Vedas, or you can read a scripture that's like 1,000 years old. But there's also a part wherein which I think spiritual practice, personal development also underlies an evolution. And I really think this integral framework is not too bad. I personally think still it's pretty elegant to really, again, bring discernment into different people and teachings, and where they might have a, let's say, beautiful diamond of transmission to share, but also where they need complementarity in terms of what people in their life situation truly need. So before I hand it over to you, when people ask me for advice, be it as friends, as comrades, soulmates, maybe even family, then I usually give a couple of pointers. So one pointer is, if you have been sitting on your meditation cushion for 25 years and never had a psychedelic experience, go do a psychedelic experience. If you're kind of an acid head, so you're chasing, unity consciousness, but you can't replicate it on your meditation cushion, better clock in some serious daily practice. Same when people seem to be floating 1 meter above ground, always smiling and happy faces, but they seem to have somewhat been falling prey to spiritual bypassing, then I always give the advice, maybe it's time for some solid shadow work, be it personal shadow work in your biography, trauma, ancestral work, family constellation work, or such. So this is a rich tapestry of words that I put into the middle of the room, but I'm curious on your own take on integral, less the framework. I don't care about the framework at all. It's just a map. It's not the territory, but more reflecting on shadow work, complementarity of practices. So what do you think?
I think you just said it really, really well. So I completely agree. And the words change, whether we call it integral work, whether we call it shadow work, where to me, and I'll use what I work with now, and my wife, who's a very, Annette, who's a very deep practitioner in this way, profound. And I've learned a lot from her in this regard. You see, too much, and we work with a Tibetan teacher named Soknu Rinpoche, who I have deep, great respect for. And one of the things I love about his teaching is, first of all, an incredible sense of humor, an incredible sense of not full of self. He's just, it feels like you understand that he has deep recognition and understanding, and yet he's not trying to show it in that way. And in his work, he really distinguishes between practitioners in the East and practitioners in the West. We in the West are so focused on mind. So a lot of like the non-dual paths is about letting the mind just be free, and there is no self here. I'm okay, there's no self here. All is fine. But in a certain respect, that's not true. and a certain deep respect, the shadow work that you're talking about hasn't been done. The bringing ourselves back into it, there's a disassociation that happens. And so I see too many people who become disassociated. Taking too many drugs can get you quite disassociated in that very same way. So it's an what we call integral integration, or ways in which we have to deal with. So he says, again, in the West, people's minds are very good. It's just their embodiment, their emotional life. Look at what's happening, what I see happening in America right now, where everybody is emotionally out of control. You say the wrong word and somebody could shoot you. It's just like what that is emotions building up, building up, building up. And then you say, okay, well, just meditate and be clear. And one sits there, but the emotions are what's going on. So really the work to clear the mind requires what is called in the Tibetan practice, the subtle body. How do we really find a way to get greater ease in the subtle body? And that takes a lot of deep dive. And one of the ways to really help is to be involved in nature. When one walks in the midst of trees in a forest, there's something that happened, the body feels connected. We can't get rid of our bodies. We have to find a way to let the body, so to me, the digital world, everybody is in a sympathetic mode instead of a parasympathetic mode. We have to figure out how to relax deep into our body. If we can't begin to do that, and I've seen too many meditators who are like this. So we're talking around the same thing, and there are many different methodologies to it, but one has to recognize not just getting rid of self is enough. Being able to sit and recognize that really there is no self. And then one recognizes there's total connection. So it's not just no one's here, it's how do we really connect? That's our problem. We don't care about the other. Saying no self means, oh, I don't care about you because there's no self there. We're here in this world, and I look out at trees and ocean right now, and I think I need to be taking care of them because they're me as much as I. That's where we are in the world. How do we care enough when we see a child that's hurt, when we see somebody doing something to nature? How do we care about that in the same way? You know, Mother Teresa said the problem with the world is the size of the circle of what we call family. How big can we stretch our family to really care beyond just me or my direct family?
So let's spice up the soup. And I give you a broad context, and then I'm super curious to listen in. So for whatever reason, not judging, I spent 15 years of meditating and some 7 years of shadow work because I had an early childhood trauma and yada yada before I had any psychedelic experience. And then I did ayahuasca and psychedelic assisted trauma healing with MDMA and like the whole shebang, like LSD, 5-MA or whatnot. But I was always humble enough to know that even the wildest peak experience, and I had a lot of peak experiences before psychedelics, I kind of, I would not say could self-reproduce, because you can't really reproduce these super intense peak experiences, but at least I have the recognition that within my biography, I'm complementing my shamanic path, which is pretty deep over the last decade, but I have a daily sitting practice, an intersubjective practice, a mentor, and I do shadow work. So I'm only mentioning this not to tell anybody how cool or important or enlightened Alistair is, but more with the fact that with psychedelics becoming so cheap, I mean, I live in Berlin, So you buy this like for nothing. I mean, it costs less than a cocktail in a bar. That on one hand, I find it incredibly helpful and meaningful, like that most likely, I don't know, 100 million human beings in a year have a psychedelic peak experience. But on the other hand, I see a lot of spiritual narcissism going on. So what I see, especially type Silicon Valley, so I will be at Burning Man for the very first time in my life. I'm very critical towards it. Nevertheless, I really think me, one of this funky creature, wants to make this experience. So a high five, I will go to Burning Man. But there are so many people that make these peak experiences that don't develop, or maybe they did not have before, like the humility, which is at the core, like the essence of all the spiritual teachings. So I don't know, maybe that's not even a question into your side, but I'm really curious how you perceive your first and own encounters and Ram Dass and like this whole first psychedelic bubble burst, and like the difference in how you perceive it these days. And again, maybe also from your side, less focusing so on the shadow aspects and more on the complementarity of what we would like to ask from people in terms of like daily practice or so.
But I think what you're raising is so critical because, and I would say back in the 60s, I saw people who, I remember one guy who would take acid and go on roller coasters for the thrill ride of it. He was not having a deepening experience. He was just out of his mind. And I was fortunate that with the group of people in those days that I hung out with, everything was quite ceremonial. So it wasn't just, wow, look at the lights, let's do strobe lights. Or so it became early in our practice. And then for most of the people in the group that I was with, some of whom I'm still in touch with, there was the movement into deeper practice. And I think that's what needs to happen. This is just a doorway. This is not the path. Now, it's the path for people who are bringing people into they're the people at the door trying to get people in. And so there's a role for the shaman to be introducing this. But for someone to just keep doing it, even if we look back at all of the traditions that use these different forms, and there's so many different forms of mind-changing substances for many different things, for things that can help addictions, for things that can help depression. So we know that some are specific. It was not given to everybody, and it wasn't done all the time. So the whole term set and setting is really critical. And I think the setting right now still isn't a holy setting for so many people. One needs to really do it in a way where there's a feeling of caring and there's a feeling of the we. So every time that I've done it, it's been in my history, there are a couple of times I've done it on my own, but for the most part, it's been in what I would consider sacred setting. And sacred setting is important because then one starts to feel the we. One's not, I remember doing a peyote ceremony many years ago in New Mexico, and I walked into this huge teepee, and I was new to it, and there was a circle, and the whole time there was chanting going on, and I just felt myself so part of that. And at a certain point, I had to go pee, and I walked out of and I remember that somebody had to bring me back in because all of a sudden, when I was by myself, everything sort of exploded out, and I realized that when I was with everyone else, there was a we that was happening. I had lost my sense of I in this grand sense of we and giving over to the music and giving over to the spirit. And it was really so profound. And the minute I was separated, everything came flashing into the light that I wasn't even aware of, because that wasn't the focus when we were gathered together to do this deeper work. And that, to me, in many of the traditional ways in which it was used, was to hold the community together. It wasn't done about me. It was done about we. And the we is what is lacking in our world right now. There's too much focus on the I. And the reason I do practice meditation, practice in truth, because I remember as a child thinking, boy, at some time in the future, now I'm obviously much older, this is going to end. What's going to happen to me? Is there anything beyond? And now we can make up that there's heaven or that there's God or whatever there is. I'm not necessarily a believer in that kind of thing. I believe that there's a place beyond sense of self that can be realized. When I see ants around, I'm fascinated by ants. I live in a place where there's lots of ants. And I see that the ants, there's a sense of we. If we have 37, they're part of a whole. Our body is made up. In our longevity center here, I'm very focused on what do we do for the body to keep it healthy. There are 37 trillion cells in our body. Which one thinks it's me? Which one is me? But it's the we that's working here. We can say, well, it's my mind. Well, if your stomach stops working or the liver stops working, mind isn't going to survive that one. So what is it? And how do we, which may shift us into the next thing we talk about, I'm fascinated by something I've learned about beehives. When a beehive, the honeybees, gets to a certain size, it's too large, and half the hive has to go and find a new home. So half leaves, they get a sort of go to some temporary covering. And they have a very clear process. They have 90 minutes to find a new place because otherwise they're not going to survive. They have a very short period of time to find a place where they're going to move and set up the new hive. So how did they do it? They send out bee scouts that go in every direction and cover a 30 miles wide, 30-mile square area, looking for the proper spot. And then the bees come back, and each bee does a little dance that is describing what he or she found. The bees that are still there, if they like the idea, start to dance with it. And so you have all these bees until finally, within a very short time, they're all dancing to one particular description, and that's where they move.
That's such a beautiful segue. So one of the last questions, not the last question, because I always leave it open, what's the last one, is we're at a crucial inflection point in history, right? And when you consciously, or we, both of us, consciously focus less on the challenges and problems, bits and pieces, riffing off the bees dancing, what gives you most hope when you look into the decades, maybe up until the end of this century ahead? So at the end of the century, neither you nor me will exist physically on this plane, most likely, right? But what gives you most hope? And what do you think are the crucial components we need as humanity to make it towards, let's say, the regenerative paradigm, the golden age, the age of abundance, of healing, of regeneration? Curious to listen in on that.
So it's a very tough question right now. because we are in such dire times. And I would start by saying, I'm not sure if humanity is going to survive this, if we're not going to be the cause of the 6th extinction period on the planet through our own egoic stupidity. We could create absolute wonder here for everybody, a true Garden of Eden in that sense. And yet the thirst, the egoic thirst for more and more for self is what at the moment is the cause of the problem. So the question becomes, what are the things that could actually change it? So I do feel the psychedelics plays a big role. And there are 2 things that happened in the last century, which was while it are raping the Amazon and the deep forest where our ancestors have lived happily, they didn't live there because they had to. They lived there because they were content, and those who weren't content went to find new land and went to find new buildings and build the new whatever. It didn't come from contentment, it came from discontent. So when we look back at our hunter-gatherers, they didn't live there because they had to. They were actually pretty content in that life. Now, we caused these psychedelics, these medicines, in the Amazon, when they talk about how do you get ayahuasca? How did you know to make brew ayahuasca? Because it comes from a vine and a leaf, and they don't necessarily grow next to each other. And separately, they don't work. One is actually, a toxin to the body. And you ask the medicine chiefs, they say, well, the plants told us, they spoke to us. And we moderns listen to that and think, how ridiculous. So there is something about listening to that nature call. So now as it comes to us, and there are the prophecies that we are going into this very dark time. These prophecies even came from these people that said, from the time of Columbus, it was going to Eagle and Eagle and the Crow kind of, and this was a certain time in history, and 500 years before the eagle is going to come out, there's going to be the next level. We're going into that, and unfortunately, we humans aren't listening very well. So there's going to be more and more problems with climate change and so on that will cause more damage and more destruction, and maybe something we will learn from that. The other big diaspora, in a way, is that the Tibetans were attacked and moved out of where they are, and all of a sudden the wisdom of thousands of years of Tibetan practice, which ultimately is about not focus on self. There is something that exists here that's beyond self. And so when I do a meditation practice, it's about sitting with a view that isn't self-absorbed, sitting with a view that isn't wanting to tell anybody anything else. It's just, how can I sit here and be fine beyond self? And so those are things that are available to us. And as things will get worse on the planet, I have the hope that there will be a rebirth to that in some way. And again, I feel the psychedelics open the door. But then the practices is where it starts to change. And so while people are into just themselves, there may be a time when survival of self is going to only happen depending on others. And it's what I feel being here in Costa Rica. It's not only depending on others, but it depends on nature. At a certain point, you live in a city, and if nature is destroyed, where are you getting your food? There's only 2 days of food left in the city. So it unfortunately seems to me that the response to too many people in power to the problems that are happening is to try and get more powerful and more dependent on what's been before, conservative of this is the way we've been doing it, we're just going to push through it. I don't think that's going to work. But I do think there has the potential for a renaissance. It's just the recognition that, unfortunately, as we see happening in the world, we're not there yet. And that means there's going to be a lot of pain still. And those of us who really, as I feel so much with you and in the meeting we were just at, who really want to envision what can be, we have to hold strong to that vision, because we may not make that vision, but if no one's holding that vision, it won't occur. But if enough of us just push to that vision and really are clear what that is and don't get egoic about it, I'm a small I in a larger we. And how can I, so my whole thing right now is, how can I help? How can I help? It's not, I'm here to help. No, it's how can I help in whatever way? And if we all just take that attitude, it's not that I don't have the answer. That's why I appreciate what you're doing. I feel from the moment I met you, I feel the depth of your being that really wants to find how can we see something that moves us more into a positive direction. And so if there's more people like yourself and those listening here and others who we know who can start to do that, that's what the future possibly holds.
So I don't want to take too much talking time, but since
Please.
Podcasts are very different, so I feel like adding a personal perspective from Alistair. So I grew up in an activist family. For whatever reason, I was lucky to carry a very early childhood trauma. I severely burned myself. And I was a very cerebral child, escaping my emotions by becoming that mental prodigy, right? Which is funny. It's a very quick supercomputer. And it took me a long time in my adulthood to basically use spirituality again to bypass my emotions. So I had a lot of a Kundalini experience in my early 20s, God experiences, unity consciousness, whatnot in my whole life. But ultimately, it took me a lot of ayahuasca experiences, also including other psychedelics. But for whatever reason, it was during an ayahuasca ceremony where I very precisely found a vision within myself, but a collective vision of peace, unity, ecological abundance, of us being interstellar species populating the Milky Way in peace and harmony with other interstellar beings. I would say a couple of 100 years in the future. This was maybe, I don't know, 7 years back or so, in my mid-30s. I'm 42 now. And this was so crystal clear that I don't know, for whatever reason, I don't know anyhow, right? I will die in, I don't know, 40 years if I'm lucky or something, right? My gut feeling is the whole collapse won't be as drastic as many proclaim. The shit will hit the fan, but the very disenfranchised will suffer most. Those on the upper, schemes of the pyramid, including myself, you and others, right, will have a tougher life, but still can live. That's more how I perceive it. And I really think this unfolding of the next layer of the regenerative paradigm, new business models, restoring the earth, radical decentralization, also a lot of social experiments in parallel to social upheaval, will really take a couple of generations. Not necessarily 20 or 200, but I don't think that the dawning of the age of Aquarius will happen in just 2 decades and then everybody's just hugging and cuddling. So maybe as a and again, this was not a question. I just feel like often I do not even share so much about me in the podcast, but since this was such a rich and deep tapestry, what are a couple of pointers of your like last, comments today on that funky, wild, Milky Way species, us, I hope, like a benevolent species, and obviously not populating just the other star systems and, extracting iron and cobalt and copper and whatnot, from these other planets and civilizations. So, yeah, I just wonder if you have like some ending words, maybe, a nugget of wisdom that you want to give to the listeners.
Well, I think what you're saying right now is very provocative. And I know for myself, having watched, as I said, my more distant relatives, grandparents, great-grandparents, as they saw the need to move. And I know for myself, that's why I came here to Costa Rica. There was this feeling. One of my other closest friends moved to Sweden, in northern Sweden now. And I do agree with you. I don't know that the world is going to go through such a calamity that I think it will get worse, but I don't know that it will therefore end. I don't know that it will be a full extinction period. Hopefully before that, we can figure out what to do. So I'm really enthused by, in having come here, and I'll just tell a little story of this. I had been running programs in the Caribbean. I was looking for a new place to create a retreat center. When I came to Costa Rica, there was something so visceral that happened in my being the minute I arrived, because Costa Rica is the only country in the Western Hemisphere with no standing army. They abolished it 70 years ago. Probably the largest country in the world with no standing army, except for countries that, are protected by other countries in that way. And the impact of that is that the people feel disarmed. The people feel actually in good mood. The people have more, the money was spent on education and healthcare. And right now, here we are, a small Latin American country. It's not tourism that it depends on. It's actually, its largest export is medical devices, because actually Costa Rica has a higher literacy rate than the United States. It's also a country that, and this woman, Christiana Figueres, that I mentioned, who was the daughter of President Figueres, who abolished the army 70 years ago, she has led a movement in this country to raise, previously it was 70%, then it got dropped when the multinationals came to 30% forest coverage. She moved it with a group of people to over 54% again. But she didn't stop there. She's actually the author of the Paris Climate Accord. So one of the things that happens in these small countries, and this is where things may invert, is that they started last year with joining 4 countries, and then now it's 70 countries that have turned 30% of their ocean territory into forever wild to protect the reefs and stop fishing and so on. Now, to make sure that happens, requires kind of policing, but still the intent is there. And so I see that the possibilities still live in the small countries. They don't seem to live in these large countries where there's no longer any, because in the small countries, the president of Costa Rica visited us here at Blue Spirit, and he was just such a warm-hearted man, and I loved meeting him. And then I heard from some friends, he goes and he does his shopping in the supermarket, and he's a regular human being, and his wife is that way as well. So it's no longer what it takes to be, is that you have to dehumanize to become somebody in the political realm. And so if we have a breakdown, there will be some terrible places like a North Korea or some where it's all dictatorial, but there will also be places that shine for what's possible into the future. And so for me in coming here, and why I've encouraged people to come and just experience this, you're invited, Alistair, I want you to come see it here, is that to live in this really changes the mood. It changes the internal feeling, and collectively, when we start to feel nature, when we start to feel a different pace of life, where we're not just completely turning on spending. People say, I don't have, see, the computer world, the digital world was supposed to give us time. I wrote a book about the relationship of time and stress. As we go faster, we feel more stress. And the digital world was supposed to give us more time. I don't know anybody who has more time these days. Everybody has less time. And the thing that's so crazy is then when they have time, they're in a certain addictive rhythm that turns on the little machine, whether it's your computer or iPhone or whatever your tablet that you're looking at. And we just get sucked into the digital world. And we don't feel relaxed. So to me, it may be the breakdown of things that allows us to go back a little bit. Some people would like us to go forward a little bit, and who knows, maybe we'll create a new race, and it'll be the digital race of computerization that creates sentient beings, and then there'll be no problem of self and I, because once they become sentient, there's only one mind, and in reality, there's only one mind.
I think that's a funny last quote. Stephan, thanks for the conversation. See you in Costa Rica.
I hope so.
Definitely. Oh, when Alistair says something, he's a very stubborn creature. I already know that.
I can feel it. You're coming. Okay.
We see you most likely, I will then ask you, where did you record it? And then I will look out of the window, and then we go for a walk on the beach, on Turtle Beach.
Sounds great.
Thanks for the conversation.
Oh, good to see you. Okay.
Thanks. Ciao.
Bye.